don't think I need to tell you that the Necrons are easily one of the most popular factions in all of Warhammer 40K. But it might surprise you to hear that a vocal part of the community claims that Games Workshop ruined them when they overhauled their lore more than a decade ago. Personally speaking, I can't say anything about the Necrons in one of my videos without at least 10 people popping up in the comment section to tell me how they're not Grimdark anymore, they're boring, and anybody who likes their new version is wrong. Now, if this isn't making any sense to you and you weren't into Warhammer before 2011, you may not know that the Necrons were a completely different faction back then. They used to be this silent army of the dead, a soulless, unthinking, apocalyptic evil that had risen to purge the galaxy of the living. There was no talking with them, no reasoning with them, no understanding them, and no hope of defeating them. In their more modern interpretation, however, the Necrons actually have personality, character, and even agency in their own story. They went from being a bunch of mindless skeletons controlled by evil deities to powerful and ancient dynasties that quite literally shattered and enslaved their own gods. Although these changes nowadays are pretty widely accepted, when they first happened, there was considerable backlash from Necron fans, some of whom are still upset more than a decade later. As a Tin Boy enthusiast myself, I got to wondering if these people actually had a point. Would the Necrons as a faction be a lot more interesting and be in a better place if Games Workshop had never overhauled their lore in the first place? What exactly changed between editions, and did G-dubs actually make them less grimdark? If so, why did they do it? In this video, we're going to be diving into the real-world history of the Necrons, from their introduction in an old White Dwarf article, to their creepy first incarnation as a full faction, all the way up to their overhaul into their modern interpretation. We're going to be examining the lore of both the Spookycrons and the Necrons, as the community has labeled them, in order to figure out exactly what changed, why Games Workshop felt the retcons were necessary, and ultimately, which version is better. We're going to be getting into all that and a whole lot more in this video, but before we dive headfirst into the Grimdark, it's that time of year again, and to celebrate, everybody's favorite orky holiday, Grotmas, is coming to Warhammer 40,000 Tacticus, the sponsor of this video. If you haven't started playing Tacticus yet, now is the perfect opportunity to jump in, as this holiday event is going to be huge. We're talking a Grotmas advent calendar, a survival event featuring the orcs and the mischievous Red Gobbo, a new battle pass featuring the terrifying Tyrannid character, the Parasite of Mortrax, and a brand new Blood Angels character, the sanguinary priest Nicodemus. From December 25th until January 7th, you can play as the Red Gobbo, and use him to spread both holiday chaos and his message of Grot Revolution. Don't let the Red Gobbo's size fool you though, he's a powerful AoE nuke summoner combo. First, he spreads Grotmas cheer in the form of explosive area damage, and then summons Grots from defeated units. As is the holiday tradition, however, he only appears during Grotmas, so once this event is over, he's going to disappear until next year. You can download and start playing Tacticus for free today by clicking on my link in the description or scanning my QR code here on the screen. When you do, you can use my code WesXmas to receive 50 Blackstone, 5 Xenos badges, and 1 requisition order. Grotmas is only going to last until January 7th, so make sure you don't miss this opportunity to experience a chaotic orc holiday and snag some powerful rewards. Again, click on my link in the description to download and play Tacticus for free today. Big thanks to Warhammer 40,000 Tacticus for sponsoring this video. In order to figure out if Games Workshop made a mistake and ultimately ruined the Necrons when they overhauled their lore back in 5th edition, we need to go back even earlier, all the way to the very beginning when the Necrons were first introduced to Warhammer 40K. Though most people believe this occurred in 3rd edition, it actually happened 5 years prior in White Dwarf issue 217, released in January of 1998. At first, it seemed like they were an evolution of the Chaos Androids, a series of model that had been kind of abandoned by Games Workshop and was seemingly retconned out of the lore. But fun fact, a Chaos Android just made an appearance in the novel Genefather this year. So technically, they're still canon, and any similarities between them and the Necrons are completely coincidental. Now, me being an obnoxious contrarian aside, this White Dwarf not only introduced us to the first Necron units, namely the Warriors and the Scarabs, as well as their associated rules for 2nd edition, but it also gave us the earliest version of their lore. What's here is admittedly pretty sparse, and by Games Workshop's own admission, the army was still in development at this time. But what they gave us is pretty interesting. We're told that the Imperium is familiar with the species known as the Necron tier, as their explorator fleets have encountered their ancient ruins on many worlds across the galaxy. However, they're all believed to have gone extinct tens of millions of years ago, and any information they learn about them is then subsequently locked away in the vaults of Terra. It's not exactly something that's new territory for the Grimdark future, but over the last several centuries, the Imperium has had many of its far-flung worlds and mining colonies attacked by an unknown threat. Whoever this enemy is isn't leaving behind any trace of their existence, nor any survivors to explain what happened. Since the sites of these attacks are not critically important to the Imperium's operations, most of the time they don't really launch a formal investigation, and the attacks are just attributed to roaming bands of orcs or Eldar raiders. Now, that would all change when another attack occurred on a hermitage deep in the Aphis sector. Now this time, a piece of evidence actually managed to survive, a single vid feed that contained a few minutes of uncorrupted footage. Upon review, a strange humanoid robotic creature was witnessed being blown apart, its upper torso landing just in frame. Within only a handful of frames, however, it suddenly disappeared without a trace. Later in the vid feed, another casualty is observed, though this one doesn't vanish. It just lays there for several minutes before appearing to get back up and continue fighting like nothing had happened. This was the link that the Imperium had been missing. Suddenly, all of those previous mass disappearances and sites of destruction were of renewed interest. At the time, they believed this to be a newly discovered species. But just to make sure, the vaults of Terra were opened and the Imperial scribes scoured the archives looking for any references that matched the runes and hieroglyphics observed on the robotic raider's torso. As it turns out, those symbols had been encountered before, in the ancient tombs of the Necron tier. And thus, with this introduction, the Necrons were officially introduced to the lore of Warhammer 40K. After this, in issue 218, we would receive rules for using Necron Lords and Necron Destroyers, and in issue 220, there was an article on how to construct Necron terrain. The first piece being depicted was a black pyramid covered in Necron runes. Now, many assumed this meant that the Necrons would be getting a full army release in the near future, but were surprised to see that they were not included in the core book when 3rd edition launched in autumn of 1998. In February of the following year, in White Dwarf issue 230, a chapter-approved Necrons article was released that combined all of their previous rules, and we were given a summary of their lore as it stood so far by Rick Priestley. At this point in time, the Necron tier were said to be a species that had died 60 million years ago due to a galaxy-wide catastrophe that obliterated their organic bodies. Facing their own extinction, they constructed robotic counterparts that they downloaded a copy of their consciousness into and then sealed them away in stasis vaults. Now, millions of years later, individuals attempting to explore these tombs have accidentally set off a system of alarm bells, and they've all started to wake back up. The Imperium doesn't know why these Necrons are conducting their raids. Some believe that their confinement has caused their encoded personalities to degrade, and they're now only acting on crude instinct and half-remembered purpose. Yet, others think something more sinister is going on, and the reason they're abducting human population centers is because they're trying to revert back to an organic species. Now, I personally had never read any of this before starting to do research for this video, and I found it really interesting. Even though this predates their first codex, and biotransference isn't a thing yet, we're already seeing the notion that the Necrons want to reverse it being firmly established. And speaking of that first codex, 3 years later, in July of 2002, the Necrons' 3rd edition book would launch, and they would become a mainstay in the franchise going forward. Now, for context, most of the time when Necron fans claim that Games Workshop ruined the faction and that they used to be way more grimdark, this is the book that they're talking about. And if you're a fan of the Necrons in any capacity and you've never read their 3rd edition codex, you definitely owe it to yourself to track one down and give it a read. Not only is it an iconic piece of Warhammer's history that introduced concepts like the Old Ones, the Catan, and even the War in Heaven with actual substance, but the whole thing is written in a really interesting way that's totally different from codexes that had released at the time or that would come in the future. Although it's light on actual lore in the form of factual information about the species' culture, motivations, history, battle strategies, etc., it's instead filled with small vignettes and short stories designed to build suspense and dread with every page turn. It was Games Workshop's intent at the time that the Necrons should be scary, and this book absolutely succeeded in doing that. They were an ancient, reawakened evil, beyond anything that mankind had faced before. In a less is more approach to storytelling, the authors very cleverly kept everything vague and mysterious. giving the reader just enough information to ground them in the horror, while letting them fill in the blanks with their own terrifying details. It's honestly a very Lovecraftian approach to storytelling. The Codex makes you feel like you're an Imperial investigator reading through a collection of after-action reports and eyewitness testimonies concerning an unknowable cosmic horror. Although each of the stories is different and has their own merits, some of the standouts to me were a first-hand account from an early battle against the Necrons, where they rose from the sands, slaughtered everybody, and then dragged them back beneath the earth. A salvage operation that goes terribly wrong after a piece of Necron technology is recovered, and a naval battle against their ships, where, spoiler warning, it does not go well for the Imperium. In addition to the 5 units from the White Dwarfs, this book also introduced us to some new units in the form of Flayed Ones, Tomb Spiders, Heavy Destroyers, Wraiths, Pariahs, and the Monolith. Now unfortunately, the lore in these new editions is pretty light. Most people think the Flayed Ones were scarier in 3rd edition, but there's really nothing about them here. The description just says that the Imperium doesn't know why they're covered in skin, and that they think they do this as a way of spreading fear throughout the enemy's ranks. Now, the Pariahs are arguably the more interesting unit here, and unfortunately, they only ever appeared in this book. They were said to be the result of Necron experimentation in the form of combining humans with their technology in order to create psychic blanks. Now, as I said before, the lore in 3rd edition is pretty light, and the book's more focused on being spooky. But there's a good in-lore reason for this. This tome was written by the Imperium, and at this point in time, they don't really know anything about the Necrons. So to me, I view this as their first attempt to catalog information about a new threat, and thus it makes for some pretty immersive reading. Now, all of that changes when you get to the Catan section, because now it's no longer the Imperium narrating. It's a lot more streamlined in its presentation, and it basically just lays everything out for us. This is where we learn about the Necrons' early history, their fight against the Old Ones, and how they came to make contact with, start worshipping, and eventually be enslaved by the Catan. As a lot of this information directly contradicts what was written in the White Dwarf articles, in an ironic twist, the retcons with the Necrons are already occurring with this very first book. In the previous articles, the Necron tier became the Necrons to live on after being killed by an unavoidable galaxy-wide extinction event. Now we learn that they were frail and sickly people that ended up declaring war on another species known as the Old Ones out of jealousy for their comparatively long lives. The Catan would make contact with them, end up being worshipped by the Necron tier, and eventually their new gods consumed the entire species, leaving behind a legion of mechanical slaves shackled to the will of their insane deities. The Necrons might not be given much character in this book, but by contrast, we learn a ton about both the Deceiver and the Nightbringer. We also learn that at one point, there were a whole lot more of the Catan, but during the War in Heaven, they would end up turning against each other until only 4 were left. These include the 2 mentioned before, the Outsider and an unnamed 4th entity that was almost certainly the Void Dragon. Now, although we're given a pretty extensive play-by-play on the War in Heaven in this book, including all of its events as they played out, this isn't the Necron versus the Old One story that most of the community is familiar with. Instead, it's the Catan versus the Old Ones. The Necrons are basically just a weapon that they're using. Now, in this book, after the Catan ate all of them and turned them into metal robots, they would end up seeking out more followers by subjugating large portions of the galaxy. Any of the planets that the Catan took would have their entire population forced into worshipping them. Then, at their leisure, they would devour these populations, cultivating them like cattle. Now, for most of the War in Heaven, the Old Ones are on the back foot. The Catan are too powerful to deal with, and the Old Ones are scrambling to come up with something new. They eventually make a comeback when they create the Eldari and a bunch of other psychic races, because as it turns out, the Catan had a particular weakness against energies of the warp. Now, even though this proved to be effective at first, it would ultimately end up dooming the Old Ones. All of those psychic species were causing the warp to twist and become malevolent, the once peaceful entities that lived there becoming ferocious predators that desperately sought to claw their way into our reality and satiate their dark hunger. The war would eventually swing back in the Catan's favor, and they would strike back against the Old Ones until they only had a few bastions remaining. It was at this point that the Old Ones created the Quarks and the Jokero, but it was already too late. Not long after this, a monstrous plague of terrifying creatures known as the Enslavers would tunnel their way out of the warp and into our reality, with the sole goal of consuming all life. This was the straw that broke the camel's back. The last bastions of the Old One were destroyed, and the species disappeared from history. Now, the C'tan obviously were happy that they won the war, but they weren't happy that the enslavers were now eating all of their potential worshippers and primary food source. But there really wasn't much they could do about it, so they went down into the Necrons' tombs deep beneath the surface of worlds that had been scoured entirely of life, as to not draw the enslavers' attention. There, they would enter into stasis crypts and wait out the next 60 million years. The Star Gods figured that the enslavers would inevitably destroy everything, but eventually new life would evolve to replace it. They just had to be patient. When they awoke in the future, the galaxy would once again be teeming with potential worshippers ready to be enslaved, and the grisly harvest could begin again. Fun fact, in this version of the story, the Necrons never actually went to sleep. It's implied that they were active the entire 60 million years, standing guard over their slumbering deities. Also, random thought, and I might end up pulling this out of the video, but going back and reading this, the name War in Heaven makes so much more sense in its original context, when it was the C'tan versus the Old Ones, i.e. destroyer gods versus creator gods. Although I definitely prefer the 5th edition version, which we're gonna get into, the increased focus on the Orcs, Necrons, and Eldar perspective, it definitely makes the name feel a little out of place by comparison. When the 3rd edition codex came out, the portion of the community that it appealed to absolutely loved it, regardless of whether they decided to actually start playing the army for themselves or not. However, as time went on, the cracks began to become more and more apparent, and their appeal steadily began to dwindle. Back then, it was never a guarantee if you were going to get a codex or not, and Games Workshop had an annoying tendency of going radio silent. Not only did the Necrons never receive a 4th edition codex, but they wouldn't get any kind of meaningful update for 9 years. And in that time, larger and larger segments of their fanbase started to drift away and become interested in different factions. Now, of course, that all changed in 2011 when their 5th edition codex finally came out, and the faction got a complete overhaul. This book introduced us to a ton of new lore, including Necron-named characters, which before was unthinkable. And despite the fact that this book was pretty well received by the wider 40K community at the time, you may be surprised to hear that amongst the Necron players that had stuck it out all 9 of those years without changing factions, reactions were mixed at best and outwardly hostile at worst. Many Necron players declared that Games Workshop had ruined their favorite faction. In the next section of this video, we're going to get specifically into all of the changes that occurred, but first I think it's important that we take a minute to discuss why Games Workshop felt it necessary to change course with the Necrons in the first place. Now, as cool as they were also admittedly pretty one-dimensional. The C'tan were the only part of the faction that had any kind of agency or characterization in their story, and even they were pretty simplistic in their goals of just wanting to eat everybody. Warhammer was expanding and evolving, the Black Library was starting to release new material at regular intervals, and the overall catalog of lore that was 40K was expanding exponentially. With other factions, it was super easy to write about them and come up with all kinds of new and interesting developments for them. They were each complex and nuanced in their own way, but the Necrons, not so much. In their current form, they only really served as a villain of the week for the Space Marines to kill. Now, of course, they were not the only silent, creepy faction, as there was also the Tyranids, but unfortunately, they both kind of filled the exact same niche. For many, it made sense why the Tyranids were silent and unrelatable, but when it came to the Necrons, many Warhammer fans felt it was a massive missed opportunity. They were the most ancient and advanced species in the galaxy, who at one point had conquered pretty much all of it. They had a rich, complex history rife with interesting details to be further explored. But the C'tan turning them into soulless, mindless slaves with no will of their own basically threw all that out the window. The C'tan overshadowed the Necrons so much that they began to feel like background props in their own story, which without question had a huge impact on their long-term appeal. And I'll fully admit that this is me being less objective here and likely just salty about games I lost to the stupid Nightbringer 15 years ago, but it never made any sense that the C'tan were playable characters in 3rd edition. Games Workshop's design philosophy at the time was that they didn't want to include anything Primarch tier or above in the baseline tabletop game, as it just didn't make sense for the scale they were trying to depict. Primarchs, let alone actual deities, were way too powerful to be quantified into stat blocks and point values. If you're a person who plays the Warhammer tabletop game, can you imagine trying to do this with a Chaos God? How many points to field Khorne or Nurgle? What about the God Emperor? What kind of detachment does he fit into? Even in modern 40k, where the Primarchs are starting to return, or even larger games like Apocalypse where you can field Titans, the idea of fielding an actual deity is just ridiculous. It would be like 1 billion points at minimum. Yet from 2002 until 2011, there they were. 2 actual deities on the tabletop. The Deceiver was only 50 points more than a Land Raider, by the way. And that's a Land Raider with no upgrades. Now, it's true that he was technically the weakest of the C'tan, and the Nightbringer had his overall power reduced after losing his main weapon to the Warp, but come on, the concept is still just obnoxious. And don't get me wrong, in the tabletop game back then, they were still powerful and a huge threat, but they weren't unbeatable like a god in this context should be, not by a long shot. They still had to confine to the game's mechanics and balance, which undermined their status as a deity and also in the grand narrative of 40k, kinda made them look pathetic. It's like, look at that, Mr. Bond, with +1 strength on the charge, my 10 orc knobs with big choppas just killed your literal god. Wah, Mr. Bond. But what exactly changed in the 5th edition Codex? What was Games Workshop's answer to all of these problems, and why did some Necron players absolutely hate the direction they decided to go in? If the 3rd edition Codex was light on lore and instead focused more on the faction's vibe, then the 5th edition book went in the exact opposite direction. Every single page was bursting with concrete information about the Necron's history, personality, different units, and everything else you could think of. Focus was now put primarily on the Necrons themselves, while the C'tan had their role dramatically reduced. From my perspective, this ultimately just made sense. The last time I checked, this was Codex Necrons, not Codex C'tan. Pretty much everything that was missing from the first book was now being laid out for us. We learned all about the Necron tomb worlds, including how they operate, how they come back online, how many there potentially are, and how they're maintained. We learned about how the Necrons were able to achieve faster than light travel without the warp via the Dolem Gates, a construct that allowed them to temporarily punch a hole in the webway. The Necrons were no longer mindless slaves, but had complex societies and systems of hierarchy. The book taught us about their command structures, including all of the different HQ units and their roles within their culture. We learned about the Cryptex and their different techno-magics they wielded. We learned about the Nemesaurs, the generals of their armies. We learned about overlords, the noble courts, and the high kings of the different Necron dynasties, the Pharaons. In addition to the Necrons themselves now having actual character and personality, these dynasties, actual sub-factions for the Necrons, were probably the biggest and most important change introduced in this book. The Necrons were no longer a monolith. Every dynasty had its own aesthetics, personality, history, cultures, and methods of waging war. There was now actually an in-lore reason why your Necrons may be painted a different color other than silver. Not only did the dynasties give an actual in-lore reason for you to customize your army, but they presented players with an opportunity to focus in on specifically what they found interesting about the faction. Do you want your Necrons to still resemble their 3rd edition counterpart as a faction of undead conquerors that want to enslave the galaxy and purge the living? Well, now you have the Sautek dynasty that still encapsulates that ideal to the T. Or maybe you want your ancient dynasty to be gaudy as with more wealth, treasure, and powerful technology than any other. Not to mention with a sick paint scheme to boot. Then check out the Nihilic dynasty. Or maybe you want to go a step beyond what they were in their previous incarnation. Maybe you want to have their grim darkness turned all the way up to 11. Well, now you have the Novak dynasty, who is obsessed with butchering organics, forbidden blood rituals, and brutal melee combat. Not only did this book introduce us to a ton of new units for the Necrons, each with a dedicated page for their lore by the way, but it also gave us a bunch of Necron-named characters. To build on this, they introduced a more concrete reason why some Necrons retained their personalities and others did not. We were told that the process used to turn them into the Necrons in the first place was not just the will of the C'tan, it was a scientific process known as biotransference. When their bodies were being constructed, resources were not unlimited. Thus, the best materials were reserved for the ruling class. The mid-tier materials went to the military class, and whatever was left over was used to construct bodies for the common folk. The higher grade the components were, the more likely they would retain their personality when they woke up. minus any degradation that occurred due to factors of time and circumstance beyond their control. With the peasants in particular, the parts used in their mechanical minds were only powerful enough on average to preserve a spark of awareness that served to torment the individual with memories of a past they once knew. Now robbed of joy and experience, death would have certainly been preferable for them, but they no longer had the wit to realize it. Although some Necron fans grumbled about how they preferred their Spookycrons to be silent, or that they didn't like the Egyptian theming, even though technically speaking that existed back in the White Dwarfs, most didn't particularly have an issue with them being conscious. They also didn't really seem to mind any of the new units. The more controversial change was what Games Workshop decided to do with the Catan and how they retconned the events of the War in Heaven. So let's get into everything that changed. Now, whereas the 3rd edition book kinda skimmed over the Necron tier's early history and instead gave us a play-by-play of the War in Heaven itself, the focus now has mostly shifted back to that early history and the events surrounding biotransference. This is mostly done in order to incorporate the dynasties themselves as well as some key named characters. Now previously, we were told that the war between the Necrons and the Old Ones started solely because the Necron tier were jealous of the Old Ones' immortality. This remains largely true, but a lot more nuance has been added. In both versions, the Necron tier are a species that were born under a baleful star, something that had a direct impact on their evolution and resulted in them being short-lived and sickly people. Attempting to find solace somewhere else, they spread out to many other planets, but no matter what they did or how powerful their technology became, they could not undo the star's influence on their DNA. In the first book, it tells us that they conquered other worlds, without giving any real specifics on how big their empire was. But in this new book, it states they, quote, spread ever further until much of the galaxy answered to their rule. The big change with the Old Ones' introduction is that the Necrons hate them not because they're jealous, but because they ask them for help. They were not just envious of immortality, they sought its secrets to save their people, a request that the Old Ones denied. And they didn't just declare war on them out of the blue like before. A lot of time passes between their first encounter and when that actually occurs. After being denied by the Old Ones, the Necron tier would continue on in their expansion efforts. But as their empire grew larger and larger, their unity began to erode. Different sectors would attempt to secede and form their own dynasties, many of them beginning to war amongst each other for resources, territory, and the right to independence. This resulted in a massive civil war where all of the dynasties were embroiled in infighting, known as the First Wars of Secession. The Triarch, the ruling council of the Necron tier, determined that the only hope for uniting their people once again lay in conflict with an external enemy. And the Old Ones were absolutely perfect for this, as none had forgotten the insult from the millennia prior. Thus, the Triarch would declare war on the Old Ones and offered amnesty to any successionist dynasty who willingly returned to the fold. Thus lured in by the spoils of victory and the promise of immortality, the Separatist realms abandoned rebellion and the War in Heaven began. In the early part of the War in Heaven, much remains unchanged here. The Necrons have superior technology to the Old Ones, but their mastery of the webway means they can constantly outmaneuver them. In both versions, this results in the Necrons getting smashed over and over to the point where the Old Ones kinda just see them as an annoyance. The 3rd edition book jumps right to them making contact with the Catan, but in this one, once again we're given a little bit more insight into what was going on with the dynasties first. As the centuries wore on, all of the dynasties committed to the War in Heaven started to fracture. Many of them were said to view the war as unwinnable, vying for peace instead, something the Triarch would not allow. This led to the Second Wars of Secession. Law and order completely collapsed, and the civil wars fought this time were far more destructive and bloody than their predecessors. It is said that if they wanted to, the Old Ones could have easily wiped out all of the Necron tier at this point without much effort, but perhaps because of their benevolent nature, they didn't, and consequently, it made the Necrons everybody else's problem in the future. But I'm getting ahead of myself. So now we get to where the Catan enter the picture, and it's where some of the biggest retcons in this book actually occur. Whereas before, it was left intentionally vague how the Necron tier first made contact with them, this time around it was specifically because the ruling class was trying to find something to give them an edge in the War in Heaven and stop the Wars of Secession. Now in desperation, they had turned to obscure lore and fringe sciences. In the first book, the Necron tier believed the C'tan were the progeny of their deities collectively worshipped throughout their society. They were so enraptured by the C'tan's abilities that worship of them quickly replaced the old deities and overtook Necron society. For the C'tan's part, they reveled in the adulation of uncounted mortal slaves. Now, with their gods on their side, the Necron tier stood ready to renew their war against the Old Ones. But the C'tan had one more boon to grant them: immortality and stability. Just like the Necron tier had made physical bodies for the C'tan from the material used in their ships, so too would the Necron tier themselves receive similar forms. Their cursed flesh would be replaced, and their discarded organic bodies subsequently ended up being devoured by the C'tan. Soon, the Star Gods had feasted upon the entire species and left behind only ghostly echoes of what was. Now, over here in the 5th edition codex, even though the C'tan still appear kinda godlike after First Contact, which causes many of the dynasties to immediately start trying to seek their favor, they do their best to conceal just how powerful they really are. They come to the Necron tier as a meek and humble ally, one that shares a mutual hatred for the Old Ones. Just like before, it is the Deceiver who comes first. But this time, he's not vaguely communicating to the entire species. He's specifically talking to their supreme leader, the at the time Silent King, Zarek, another new addition to the lore. Now, in the previous book, there was nothing to indicate that the C'tan and the Old Ones knew the other existed. But this time around, the Deceiver tells the Silent King that the two of them were actually ancient enemies. They fought a long and bitter war against the Old Ones, but ultimately were defeated. Fearing the Old Ones' retribution, they had hidden themselves away. But now, by working together, they could both have the vengeance they desired and make the Old Ones pay for their arrogance. Now, whereas biotransference, even though that was a term that didn't exist in 3rd edition, was something that the C'tan back then enforced on the Necrons, it's now being presented as a choice. And more than that, the Deceiver frames it as a gift, a promise of unity, vengeance, and immortality in exchange for their aid in the C'tan's war against the Old Ones. Now, Zarek is definitely somebody who's in way over his head here, but to his credit, he's not willing to just take the Deceiver at his word. And also, he's not actually called the Deceiver. He tells him his name is the Messenger, but that's besides the point. Zarek ends up taking all of the information that he tells him back to the other members of his court, where they end up debating back and forth for months on whether or not to accept the C'tan's offer. Eventually, they all agreed that they should do this, but there's still one single holdout: another new character, Orican the Diviner. This guy is the court astrologer, and he foretold that the Alliance would bring about a renaissance of glory, but it would ultimately destroy the soul of the Necron tier people. His words, however, ended up falling on deaf ears. The court's ambition eroded all caution, and the prophecy was dismissed. A year after First Contact, the Triarch formally agreed to the Alliance and thus doomed their species. Through a combination of the C'tan's knowledge and the technological genius of Illuminar Xeris, giant biofurnaces were constructed that were used to burn away the Necron tier's organic bodies and replace them with ones of living metal. In the last book, after this was completed, the C'tan were in complete control. But now, that honor is going to fall to the Silent King due to a system of command protocols embedded in each of the Necrons' minds. He doesn't end up activating them right away though. In fact, he wouldn't see the necessity for them until after he underwent biotransference himself and saw the full horror of what he had subjected his people to. At first, everything seemed like it had been a success. He was thinking more clearly than he ever had in life, and all of the aches and pains associated with an organic body no longer plagued him. But there was this profound feeling of emptiness in his mind that he couldn't put his finger on, a hollowness of spirit that defied rational explanation. Eventually, he came to the horrible conclusion that he no longer had a soul. None of his people did. Every single member of their species had their spiritual essence devoured by the C'tan. By accepting the Deceiver's bargain, he had not saved his people, but damned them. Despite this, there was no going back. The Silent King activated the command protocols, both because perfect unwavering unity was certainly preferable to the wars of succession that had preceded biotransference, but also because he feared his people would rightfully seek vengeance for what he had done to them. Over time, the burden of complete control and the weight of his mistake became a burden almost too great to bear. But he couldn't set his people free, not yet, not on the cusp of victory. If he did, they would likely go right back into infighting. In addition, his hatred for the Star Gods was becoming all-consuming. He would play the part as their ally for now, but by the end of this, they would pay for their deception. After having devoured the souls of an entire species, the C'tan got a significant power boost. It was said that at this point they could create black holes at will, raise entire worlds, and snuff suns out of existence. Zarek knew that in their empowered state, he and the Necrons would stand no chance against them, so instead he waited. Just like before, the C'tan would end up turning against each other, drunk on their own greatness. By the end, only a handful remained, and the final battle, where they did emerge triumphant over the old ones, took an enormous toll, leaving them in a weakened state. This was the moment that the Silent King had been waiting for. Using the command protocols, he turned his legions against the Star Gods. In their arrogance, they had no idea what was coming until it was too late. The Necrons focused the unimaginable energy of the living universe into weapons too mighty for even the C'tan to endure. Even still, Zarek knew that this would not be enough. The C'tan were plugged too deeply into the fabric of reality to ever be completely destroyed. So instead, he settled for shattering them into thousands of shards, each one subsequently being sealed within a Tesseract labyrinth. In the future, these shards would be wielded as weapons by the Necrons, whether as a tool of destruction or tortured and used as a power source, and thus the C'tan we knew in the 41st millennium were retconned to no longer be fully fledged deities, but simply a sliver of one. The Necrons' gods were no longer in control of the faction, but enslaved to it. Which, like I mentioned earlier, a lot of Necron fans who liked the original incarnation of the C'tan were not happy with. But in exchange, the Necrons were now center place in their own story, and it actually made sense why we could use the C'tan in the tabletop game. Anyways, the Silent King's vengeance had been satiated and their ancient rival destroyed. But there was another problem. The battle against the Old Ones had taken a considerable toll on the Necrons, and the subsequent war against the C'tan saw millions more of them destroyed. The Eldar had risen to power, and in the Necrons' weakened state, there was no chance of truly standing against them. So be it, thought the Silent King. Let the Eldar shape the galaxy as they see fit for a time. All empires of flesh and blood rose and fell. All were subject to entropy. All except for his people. With one final use of the command protocols, he ordered all of the Necrons to go to sleep deep within the stasis vaults of their tombs. After they were all sealed away, he destroyed the command protocols for good, in a small gesture of atonement for his sins. When his people reawoke in the future, their destiny would be theirs once again. The Silent King then left the Milky Way in a self-imposed exile, and we would not hear from him again until the end of the 41st millennium, and over a decade later in the real world, when the Silent King returned to the lore and actually got a playable model in the tabletop game. So yeah, at this point in time, 90% of the Necron's lore can trace itself back to 5th edition, or at least was built upon the foundation set by this book. There's not really much left of the original Necrons, and in fairness, there wasn't really much to them to begin with. Even still, there are some Warhammer fans that claim that 5th edition ruined the Necrons, and that Games Workshop ultimately made them less grimdark. But is this actually true? As somebody who likes franchises with deep treasure troves of lore that you can get lost in, I think the 5th edition Necrons were an undeniable improvement in just about every single way. Whether or not they're less grimdark though, that's a little bit harder to answer, so let's get into it. Honestly, the overall lessening of the grimdark within Warhammer 40K is a topic that probably deserves its own video, so let me know if you'd like something like that made by me in the future. In the meantime, we'll keep it focused on just the Necrons. Whether or not they're actually less grimdark as a faction now really depends on the individual's perspective of what it means to be grimdark. Although we call grimdark its own genre, it's really more of a vibe or atmosphere than an actually well-defined narrative structure. Adventure, fantasy, science fiction, crime, and horror are all genres that you can each make grimdark by flavoring them with some key elements. So let's talk about what grimdark actually is. Grimdark stories tend to emphasize bleak, brutal, and morally ambiguous themes, and are often set in dystopian or post-apocalyptic worlds. Whatever form the setting takes, it is designed to be harsh, cruel, and unforgiving. These worlds don't just challenge the characters within them, but seek to crush them. Happy endings are almost non-existent, and any victories that occur come at great cost, often feeling temporary at best. Violence in these stories is commonplace and often used as a narrative tool to highlight just how harsh the world really is. Now, when ethical dilemmas arise in a Grimdark story, they often involve choosing the lesser evil with no true good outcome. Entropy is an unchanging constant, and any character's attempt to mend or fix this broken world often fail or lead to unintended consequences. When it comes to Grimdark characters, the line between hero and villain is traditionally blurred. These characters are complex and deeply flawed. Positive traits like optimism or heroism have a tendency to either be subverted or punished, while selfish and brutal acts are rewarded, even if that reward traditionally is nothing greater than survival. Individuals in positions of power in a Grimdark story are traditionally portrayed as being corrupt, oppressive, or incompetent. Additionally, and to me this is important to the Necrons specifically, Grimdark stories are often tragic in nature. They are bleak, hopeless, and permeated by persistent feelings of ultimate futility, existential dread, despair, cynicism, and cosmic indifference. So, with all that in mind, we can clearly see that the 3rd edition version of the Necrons were undeniably grimdark. They embodied the horror of a soulless, unstoppable, and unknowable force, slaves stripped of their free will, personality, and even organic forms, driven by the commands of incomprehensible cosmic entities, gods that desire nothing more than the consumption of all life. Now, this combination definitely presented them as a vision of utter futility for all organic species that would attempt to fight them. They were an enemy that you couldn't reason with nor understand. And although they were definitely dripping with grimdark vibes, there's unfortunately a balancing act that needs to be achieved that I think their original book kind of failed to do. They nailed the grimdark part for sure, but forgot to make them an actual faction. As they were just kind of tangible personifications of the inevitable doom of the universe. 5th edition Necrons, by comparison, were a lot more human-like. They suddenly weren't this unknowable cosmic horror anymore, but had motivations that were understandable, relatable, and in some instances pitiable. This, combined with the fact that we suddenly knew a whole lot more about them, made them a lot less scary. But scary does not necessarily equal grimdark. You can have a grimdark story that has no horror elements at all, it's just bleak and miserable. So, I would argue that both versions are equally grimdark, they just focus on different grimdark elements. Whereas the 3rd edition Necrons were an apocalyptic, unthinking evil, their 5th edition incarnation was more complex, morally ambiguous, and rooted in themes of hubris, existential despair, and eternal regret. Earlier Necrons killed because they were told to do so. Now Necron overlords act with cold, inhuman logic, scouring entire worlds and killing untold billions as they see the living as beneath them. Whereas before, they didn't have any thoughts about human beings at all. Now they viewed them as a plague, vermin that needed to be eradicated. Many of them pursuing callous and disturbing experiments on other species in order to advance their own agendas. Even the characters that seem at first like they may be objectively less grimdark are still grimdark. I know there's a lot of memes about Trazyn that kind of turn him into a comic relief character, and don't get me wrong, I love this portrayal of him, but his obsession with collecting and preserving the galaxy's history is still rooted in some pretty grimdark tropes. First, he kidnaps and enslaves entire populations. The prime motivator for doing what he does is that the galaxy is on its way out. Everything will end, everything will be destroyed, and everyone will die. It's ironic because we throw around Trazyn memes all the time and see him as this goofy kleptomaniac, but then you remember that the reason he's doing this is unbelievably bleak, that the galaxy cannot be saved, and even if it could, maybe it shouldn't. A Necron character that's a little less morally ambiguous and definitely seems less grimdark at first is Nemisar Zondrak, and he seems kinda like a good guy. I mean a good guy in the sense that he's still a brutal conqueror, but he demands that any who fight under his banners must conduct themselves with honor and chivalry, that their enemies must be shown the respect they deserve. He refuses to use underhanded methods or units, so no wraiths or death marks, and when prisoners are captured by him, he ensures that they're treated with dignity. And it's around that time that you find out that the only reason he does all of this is because he's losing his mind. The Great Sleep left the circuitry in his brain damaged beyond repair, and he still believes he's back in the first wars of secession. all of his opponents, be they humans, orcs, or even other Necrons, appear to him as his fellow flesh and blood kinsmen of the Necron-tier dynasties, still fighting for their independence. The dude is trapped in a moment of time that passed more than 60 million years ago and is incapable of understanding the horror that he and his people have become, let alone what has happened to the galaxy. It gets even worse when you realize that the ruling council absolutely hates him and sees him unfit for duty, and they're actively conspiring to remove him. Even this little glimmer of surface-level hope with the Necrons exists only to be crushed by the grimdark future. And then there's the Faustian bargain they made with the C'tan in the first place. In the previous iteration, they were no longer conscious afterwards. Both versions aren't really alive, but I think you understand what I mean when I say the 3rd edition Necrons died on the day of biotransference. Their corpses were just being puppeted around by the C'tan afterwards. In their new lore, with the exception of baseline warriors and at least one named character, the Necrons are fully aware of the horror of their existence. They may not be enslaved to the star gods anymore, but they're still slaves to their soulless, undying form. The Necrons once controlled the galaxy, and they want to reclaim it once again. But the galaxy that they knew died 60 million years ago. The new one they find themselves in is broken beyond repair, both figuratively and quite literally, as currently the Great Rift has torn it in half. They are forced to endure endless cycles of war and decay, with no hope of escape. They can't even look forward to their death for release as they no longer have souls, and thus no chance of a peaceful afterlife. In a bid to save his people, the Silent King condemned them to an eternity of conflict and slaughter. The Necrons are a faction doomed by their own nature and circumstances. Through their tragic backstory, fragmented identities, futile ambition, and ceaseless infighting, there's no real hope of anything past all this. It honestly boggles my mind that somebody can hear all that and somehow claim they're not grimdark anymore. It's like, my dude, what else do you want? In conclusion, did 5th edition make the Necrons less scary? Yes, absolutely it did. But did it make them less grimdark? No, not at all. Both versions are still grimdark, they're just grimdark in different ways. But what do you think of all this? Do you agree or disagree with any of the points I made in this video? Do you like the new direction the Necrons have gone in, or do you wish Games Workshop left them the way they were back in 3rd edition? If you were to change anything about the Necrons, what would it be? And what kind of story developments do you think would be really interesting with them? Personally, I'm hoping we get a novel that develops the relationship between Imhotep the Stormlord and the Silent King, as all of the lore kinda indicates that they would both hate each other and maybe cause a Necron civil war. In my personal opinion, the book basically writes itself, and hopefully it's something that's in the pipeline at Black Library, but we'll see what happens. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, we're on the road to 1 million subscribers, so go ahead and touch that subscribe button. It's free and you'll feel a whole lot better after you do. Anyways, as always, leave all of your thoughts, questions, comments, concerns, and ideas for future videos down in the comment section below. Big thanks to everyone who supports all the work that I do, and I will catch you all in the next one.